A German friend of mine was telling me a story recently. They've been quite concerned about this political moment we're living in, as I know many of us, if not all of us here are. They were telling me a story that starts in 1982 in St. Nikolai's Church in Leipzig. There, a group of young people, young adults, wanted to get together and have an interfaith prayer circle. And apparently the bishop was not a big fan of the idea, and they had to have some back and forth. And it got negotiated such that the pastor, Christian Führer, was in charge. So they could have their prayer circle as long as he was there. They would gather every Monday night in that Gothic church, the church where Bach had debuted some of his choral pieces, his most impressive works. They would gather sometimes a dozen people or less for this interfaith prayer circle. They had no idea, I believe, when they started gathering, the impact their prayer circle would have 7 years later when the Berlin Wall finally fell. I played a lot of chess growing up, and I loved chess, and I loved trying to think, 2, 3, 4 moves ahead. I could never really get past that. And so I stopped playing chess. But I was good in 3rd grade. I peaked in 3rd grade. I have my chess trophies. My son is very impressed with my 3rd grade chess trophies. But the truth of the matter is that most of the time we can't see anything past that next move ahead. And even if you can see out a few moves past, ultimately, all we have to act on, all we have to make a move with is this present moment, this day, this breath. There's a story that has been told by generations of religious folks, Protestants especially in this country. It's a story about babies drowning in the river. You know the one I'm talking about. It was a favorite story of Martin Luther King Jr. It was the story of the people who lived in a village where they would see these babies drowning in the river, and every day they were rushing down to the river and saving babies, and they were doing a great job, working as hard as they could, but it kind of took all the energy and all the resources to do everything they could to save the drowning babies, until finally somebody said, why are these babies ending up in the river in the first place? And of course, the wise folks from the village headed upstream to try and solve whatever the systemic problem was that was leading to these babies ending up in the river. There's a critique, though, of us liberal religionists who tell that story and focus on the systemic work necessary to change the situation that leads to the babies ending up in the river. The critique is, you liberal religionists, you well-educated, you Unitarian Universalists, where are you while the babies are drowning? Dr. Kinari Webb wanted to tackle one of the world's greatest problems. She wanted to work at climate change by saving the rainforests. And so she went to Borneo, Indonesia. She was studying orangutans and how the information about them could help to inspire people to preserve and protect the rainforests and therefore work on this giant systemic issue of climate change. What she encountered, however, were that people who came to log the rainforest, who came because they needed to pay medical bills. She found every time that a family was coming in to harvest wood from the rainforest, the reason that was driving them to chop down those trees was because there was a C-section that needed to be paid for, or cancer treatment that needed to be paid for, and they did not have medical insurance. Encountering the immediate need of the people who she thought were causing the problem changed Dr. Webb's whole orientation. She ended up starting an organization called Health in Harmony because what she heard by listening to these people who were chopping down the trees is that what they needed in order to stop logging the rainforest was health care and training in sustainable agricultural practices. And so this international organization now works around the world to give those resources to the people who need them. When we encounter the most pressing practical needs, especially of the most vulnerable among us, it can inform our search for systemic solutions. But our desire to solve things systemically can also bring us to remember there are individuals living right nearby who could use a little help. Our whole year this year, I want to talk about how we as Unitarian Universalists have always thrived most faithfully when we have devoted ourselves to building the common good. And I know we are involved in so many ways in doing that already. You're doing that in your work lives and in your personal lives. You're using volunteer hours and you're building the common good right here within our beloved community. How can we focus together on tuning out some of the noise of how bad things are and tuning a little more into what we can do here and now to build the common good? This was the call that Joseph Tuckerman felt. Joseph Tuckerman was an early Unitarian born in the late 1700s. He was the college roommate of William Ellery Channing, who would go on to preach the first sermon declaring the existence of American Unitarianism in 1821, who many think of as the father of that stream of religious movement. But Joseph Tuckerman, he did not feel the call to serve a ministry in a congregation from a pulpit. Joseph Tuckerman instead was our first minister at large. And his call was to serve the needs of the wider community, to figure out what was going on for the poorest people in Boston and how he could help. His biographer calls him a pioneer in American social work. Before social work was a profession, this Unitarian minister went out and listened to people. He'd heard the stories coming from the Unitarian Boston Brahmin elite. He knew that the idea of what was wrong with poor people is that they were lazy and drunk. But he thought maybe there's more to the story than that. And he went and listened to people and asked what they really need. And what they needed, of course, was food and clothing and skills. He began to help people find ways to meet these basic needs. He got others involved. It became what was called the benevolent fraternity. He wanted to follow Jesus' example of looking out for the poorest among us and meeting them where they're at. In a time when people could not rely on the government to secure the social safety net, they wove it themselves. Our faith has always been most potent, most faithful to our call and purpose when we've focused on how we can build the common good. I want to share next Sunday some stories of the East Bay Regional Parks and the Unitarians who were involved in preserving that land. But right now, back to Berlin. There was a big demonstration there at the church. It was shortly after the massacre in Tiananmen Square. And after the Soviet Union had squashed a resistant movement in Hungary with tanks, the temperature was rising, and that prayer circle had kept meeting. 7 years now they were into their meetings, and it had grown. It had grown to the point that in 1989, when these events occurred and the call to action came from this prayer circle, 100 or 1,000 or more people ended up gathering in every major city in Germany. My friend said it was not performative, these protests, this marching. It was risky, it was edgy, it was real. The stakes were high. People put their bodies in danger. And so many factors led to the moment being a success. In retrospect, we could tell the story with some sense of inevitability, but the people at the time did not know what would work. But that day, when hundreds of thousands of people gathered, when people stormed the wall, no officer gave the order to shoot. One official of the East Germany said, "We were prepared for every eventuality, but not for candles and not for prayers." We know the board doesn't look great. Not our board here at the church, they're great. Stay with the metaphor, right? Okay, the board's not great. You could spend every minute of every day learning about the atrocities occurring and the urgent crises that need our attention, and you still wouldn't get to the bottom of it, would you? And if you're anything like me, you're spending hours circling each week around familiar conversations, worrying away at the state of our country and our world, panicking about all the devastating moves that others are making. So I'm challenging myself and you along with me to take some of that time. Could you cut it in half? Or maybe even just 10% of it and do something with that time. Do something, do anything. I have a colleague, Aya Simpson, who grew up in this church, who says, action is the remedy for anxiety. Yes, the stakes are high, and yes, the position looks terrible. And yet, it's still your move. Within any set of limitations, there are still an infinite number of possibilities. What will you do? The last couple of years, I've spent time focused on being connected with our local UU clergy, making sure we have a healthy community of clergy gathering once a month, getting together for retreats, connected and strong together. One of my next moves is to make sure I'm better connected with an interfaith clergy group. I want my prayer circle. I'm looking for a group I can get together with at least once a month and really get to know each other. It's no grand plan. It's just my next move. What's your next move? Maybe there's a child in your life who you could teach to garden once a week and give their parents an afternoon off. Maybe there's one of our good partners who you've been hearing about each month who you would like to volunteer with. Get together and meet some new people. Or maybe with the folks who were here last night, the Western Service Workers Association, who are trying to meet those most practical, desperate needs of the hardest off folks in our community, equipping with systems of mutual aid. Maybe you want to show up and volunteer with them. Maybe you want to accompany immigrants to court or hold vigil in Dublin and demand they do not reestablish another ICE detention center in the Bay Area. What might you do? Maybe you need to recommit to a day of rest. Or maybe there's someone in this room who is ready to run for office for your next move. A poem from a favorite poet, David White, to close. Start close in. Start close in. Don't take the second step or the third. Start with the first thing close in, the step you don't want to take. Start with the ground you know, the pale ground beneath your feet, your own way to begin the conversation. Start with your own question. Give up on other people's questions. Don't let them smother something simple. To hear another's voice, follow your own voice. Wait until that voice becomes an intimate, private ear that can really listen to another. Start right now. Take a small step that you can call your own. Don't follow someone else's heroics. Be humble and focused. Start close in. Don't mistake that other for your own. Start close in. Don't take the second step or the third. Start with the first thing close in. The step you don't want to take. May it be so, and amen.